Alrighty, we have a super quick set of notes. We're going to talk about methods to reduce urban runoff because if you remember from our impacts of urbanization notes, increased surface runoff is a really big impact of urbanization and building streets and buildings, etc. So, why is it relevant? Well, because when you have all these impervious surfaces that are not going to allow water to pass through, that dramatically increases the runoff along the surface. That means less water infiltrates into the ground, so you're not restoring aquifers or replenishing aquifers. You're also not keeping water in the local area, which I'll talk about in a moment. And also that increases flash flooding because if the water can't sink into the ground and it runs along the surface, if you have a heavy rain, and then that's going to increase flash flooding so that you're going to have these massive floods. So how do you reduce urban runoff? Well, one thing is to use something called permeable pavement. These are surfaces that would replace concrete. Um, and they would allow water to infiltrate through them. So they are permeable to water, but they still provide kind of the benefits of a paved surface. So this would not only allow water to infiltrate, but since it's kind of bumpy, as you can see, if you have water that is running along the surface and it kind of hits one of these dips or hits one of these bumps, then that will slow it down. So instead of just running along, some of it, more of it will sink into the ground. But unfortunately, they aren't as stable and indestructible as kind of normal concrete and paved surfaces. So they're best for places that aren't going to get a ton of high velocity traffic. You couldn't really replace freeways with this. This is best for parking lots, sidewalks, driveways, and low traffic roads. So it's not a solution to every region of impervious surface. Another thing that can help is to plant plenty of trees. So, what happens is when you have plants, especially trees in an area with their roots, they can kind of, make the ground a little uneven. You've seen some roots stick up from trees in the ground. And so, when water is running along after a heavy rain shower, after a rain shower, the tree's roots will kind of help slow down that water. So instead of running off, it will start infiltrating. So then you have less water as runoff, more infiltration, which allows you to have some groundwater recharge. Also, when the tree's roots pick up water and carry it into the canopy and into the leaves and the branches, that will keep the water in the area instead of it just running off immediately after rain. And then what will happen is trees will release water through something called evapotranspiration, aka just plain transpiration, which I tend to think of at its most simple level like plant sweat. And it's water evaporating from leaves. And so that's going to add moisture back into the air, which means that you can then have, instead of the air being super dry, you then have humidity. And that humidity, if enough of it gathers up, can then form clouds. Like, for example, there are large forests that create enough water vapor through transpiration that they form their own clouds, which can then have more precipitation so that you don't have a drying out of urban areas. Then there's also the leaf litter. So if you have deciduous trees that leave their leaves behind in the fall, they can create these soil conditions that will allow water to infiltrate into the soil better than if it's just kind of bare ground or just grass. So those are a very important tool in trying to decrease surface runoff. Then there are a couple of green infrastructure techniques. So one is to have green roofs. A green roof is where you take the roof of any building. It can be a house, it can be, an office building, and you cover it with some waterproofing substance, like a, very good tarp or something like that. And then you cover that with growing medium, by which I mean soil, dirt, etc. And so then what you do is you plant plant life there. So then what will happen is instead of just hitting the roof of the building and then running off onto the ground, the water will be absorbed in the area. There'll be local evapotranspiration, local transpiration, because of the plants absorbing the water. There are also other benefits, absorb some carbon dioxide, etc. But that is an example of what a green roof looks like. So you can't have huge plants, obviously. You can't like plant a tree on top of a house. Although if you plant it properly on top of like an office building or skyscrapers, you could put larger plants as long as you have the right support structure and can have deep enough roots. So that's an example of a green roof. Another thing is a rain garden. So if you have a depressed area where water kind of collects when it rains, or if you kind of plant one of these or kind of create a depression around where water drains from a roof or a street or something like that, that will kind of allow water to collect there. So that way it doesn't run off into the nearest body of water. You can then plant that area with deep rooted plants, which will help kind of anchor the area and help with infiltration. So here's an example of a rain garden. So you've got an area that's very prone to having runoff because water is going to run off of roofs when it rains. And so then you have this kind of depression area where you're going to make sure there's, it's not covered with concrete or anything. You've got your kind of soil mix, and then you've got plants in the area. And so when water hits that, it's going to slow down, and instead of running off, it's going to infiltrate into the ground. So then very little is going to run off. So you're dramatically decreasing surface runoff. Another thing is instead of like spreading out and building all these suburbs, we can zone more areas for multi-story buildings or multifamily housing. And that's kind of building up instead of out. So instead of expanding out into further areas, instead of, having this urban sprawl, you can instead build multi-level housing, so condos, apartments, etc. And that decreases the amount of land you need for housing, businesses. You can even have multi-purpose buildings. So you could have a building where, like, say, this is like shops and businesses. And then you could have housing on top, which would really let you make the most of your space. You don't have to clear as much land, you don't have to pave as much road, and so then there's less impervious surface that's going to impede water flow and water infiltration. Another thing is roads are a very large chunk of the impervious surface area we have in cities. If we can design our cities or upgrade our cities so that they don't have the population rely on cars quite as heavily, then you don't need to constantly keep expanding roads. And so you can have roads that aren't necessarily as wide, which means less impervious surface area. And then there are all the other benefits of increasing transportation, of public transportation, that is. All right, that is it. Like I said, very short set of notes and some more Unit 5 notes coming up.